Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. So this is going to be my second video on poetry tips for beginners, those who've just started out writing poetry. And today I'm going to talk about the importance of rhythm in writing poetry, the importance of rhythm when you begin to write poetry. Now, rhythm, according to me, is the most important element of poetry. It is the most important component of poetry. In fact, rhythm is what distinguishes poetry from non-poetry. However, what I want to make clear at the outset is that by rhythm here, I do not necessarily mean that the poems you write have to have a certain rhyme pattern, or you have to be well versed with the technicalities of meter, rhyme, rhythmic structures, rhyme patterns, etc. When I say that your poem needs to have a rhythm, it simply means that your poem needs to have a certain organic flow. It needs to have a certain continuity of structure. It's about the way the words have been strung together. It's the sounds your poem produces, the ambience your poem creates, the kind of language you use. Basically, rhythm refers to the flow of the poem. So even if your poem doesn't adhere to a conventional rhyme scheme, your poem can still have a rhythm. Even if you're writing a prose poem, it can still have a rhythm. So let's understand this by an example. So there's a poem called The Earth Moon by the famous British poet Ted Hughes. Now the poem doesn't have a conventional rhyming structure at all, and yet it is a masterpiece. It has a beautiful rhythm throughout. So it's a short poem. Let's read the whole poem here. Once upon a time, there was a person. He was walking along. He met the full burning moon, rolling slowly towards him, crushing the stones and houses by the wayside. She shut his eyes from the glare. He drew his dagger and stabbed and stabbed and stabbed. The cry that quit the moon's wounds circled the earth. The moon shrank like a punctured airship. Shrank, smaller, smaller, till it was nothing but a silk handkerchief torn. And wet as tears, the person picked it up. He walked on into moonless night, carrying his strange trophy. Now, as you can see, the poem doesn't have a particular rhyme structure. It doesn't follow a particular rhyme structure, and yet the poem has a certain rhythm to it. It reads so smooth. It doesn't read like the words have been strung together. So notice the way the imagery of the moon is something that consistently runs throughout the poem, and the imagery of the moon is what binds the poem together. And the word moon, if you notice, has been repeated several times in the poem, and it's not just repeated unnecessarily. It's something which is connected to the theme of the poem, and it gives a sort of an organic continuity to the poem. So the use of imagery that gives a certain organic continuity to the poem, and the repetition of certain words also gives rhythm to the poem. Then the animated tone of the poetic voice, the narrative voice narrating the incident of the man walking along and meeting the full burning moon. All this also contributes to the rhythm of the poem. So the dramatic and animated use of language can also contribute a lot to the rhythm of the poem. Now just see these lines from the poem. He drew his dagger and stabbed and stabbed and stabbed. The moon shrank like a punctured airship. Shrank, smaller, smaller, till it was nothing. Now notice the emphasis on the word stabbed and the smaller, and the way these words have been repeated, both these words have been repeated, and the repetitions, as I said, are not redundant. They're not there for the sake of it, but they are intrinsically connected to the theme of the poem, and together, the way they are interwoven with the theme of the poem, with the usage of the word moon, they give a sort of musicality to the poem, which is what rhythm really means, which is what rhythm really strives to create. It is not about following a certain rhyme pattern. It's not about following a certain rhyme scheme. As such, it's the way the theme of your poem, the kind of imagery you use, the way you put your words together, it's the way all these combine together, coalesce into a whole to create a pattern which is rhythmic. Now let's quote another poem, and this is by the famous American poet Carl Sandburg, Languages. Now short poem again, so let's read the whole poem. There are no handles upon a language whereby men take hold of it and mark it with signs for its remembrance. It is a river, this language, once in 1,000 years, breaking a new course, changing its way to the ocean. It's a mountain effluvia, moving to valleys and from nation to nation, crossing borders and mixing. Languages tie like rivers, words wrapped around your tongue today and broken to shape of thought. Between your teeth and lips speaking, now and today, shall be faded hieroglyphics. 10,000 years from now, sing and singing, remember, your song dies and changes, and is not here tomorrow any more than the wind blowing 10,000 years ago. Now this poem also, as you can see, doesn't follow a consistent rhyme structure, rhyme pattern, and yet it has a lot of rhythm. Again, the poetic voice here is addressing the reader directly, and it doesn't follow a rhyme scheme, and yet the poem has rhythm. Now here again, I emphasize the continuity, that how the theme produces rhythm. The theme is language, so the continuity of the theme using the metaphor of rivers is what works here. And the word language is again repeated several times. There's a lot of emphasis on the word language, but the way the word language is used, it's repeated, and it carries forward the theme of the poem, is producing a certain rhythm. So the use of imagery, the way you use imagery in your poetry, and how clear you are about the theme, and the continuity between different lines of the poem, the way the theme continues from beginning to the end. The end should not read like it's not connected to the beginning at all, and it should all be connected. So basically these connections are what produce the rhythm of the poem, and not adhering to a conventional rhyme structure necessarily. So like these particular lines, it's a river, this language, once in 1,000 years, taking a new course, changing its way to the ocean. So the way the language is compared to the river, and the way the process of language undergoing different transformations and mutations, permutations and combinations, the way it's compared to the journey of a river, the way it changes, it undergoes changes before it finally joins the ocean. The imagery is very apt, it is very precise, it is very exact. So this again contributes to the rhythm of the poem. So again, I emphasize rhythm is not just about the lyrical aspect, it's about the flow, continuity, the way words are coming together. Clarity of imagery also contributes to the rhythm. But more on that later in a different session when we talk about imagery specifically. So all I want to say here is that if you do want to learn about the technicalities of different rhyme schemes, different rhyming patterns, then please feel free to do so by all means. There are YouTube tutorials available on the subject. You can also read literature pertaining to the technical aspects of rhyming in poetry. But what I mean is that in order to write a good poem, it is not necessarily to consciously learn the technicalities of different rhyme schemes, of different rhyming patterns. As you continue to write poetry. And as you read poetry, different kinds of poetry, you semi-consciously start producing rhythmic patterns, certain rhyme patterns. And as it is these days, most of the people are writing in free verse. So unless and until you consciously want to follow rhyme and meter, in order for your poem to have a certain rhythm, it is not necessary for you to consciously learn these patterns. Now again, as I said, that I'm talking from my own experience as a poet. I'm a practicing poet, and by no means I'm really a teacher. So I'm not talking here really from a teacher's perspective, from an academic perspective of learning poetry technically, but I'm talking more about more from the perspective of somebody who's been writing poetry for a long time. And this has been my journey. This has been the way I learned to write poetry, and I improved my poetry writing gradually by writing in free verse, by not consciously studying a certain rhyming structure, certain rhyming patterns, because for me, to get into the technicalities of these things, then it was confusing for me, and it was something that would take me away from the spontaneity, from the sheer joy of writing poetry. So this is something that has worked for me, and it's, as I said, it's not something that will come in your poetry overnight. A consistent practice over a long period of time, along with reading poetry, is what is important. And like I said in my first YouTube video, which I made for poetry beginners, you have to go step by step. So the first step is, if you've never read poetry before, never written poetry before, but you want to write poetry, the first step is to just write, just to record your experiences, irrespective of what you think is poetry, irrespective of whether you think you know how to write poetry or not. But the first important step is writing, to get started with writing somehow. And the second most important is reading. And then other things follow. So as you sort of simultaneously juggle the act of writing poetry and reading poetry, then sense of rhythm is something that is, I think, naturally going to come to you. That sense of rhythm is something over a period of time you're naturally going to sharpen your sense of rhythm if you continue to write poetry and read poetry as well. Thank you so much for listening, and if you like my videos, if you like my tutorials, then please do subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.